An elite professor forced the maid's daughter to solve a math problem. Unaware, she is a mathematical genius. The morning was supposed to be ordinary. A mother pushing her cleaning cart down polished marble floors. A daughter, clutching a worn book, told to stay close and keep quiet. But in the grand lecture hall of Crestwood University, silence didn't last long. A professor, armed with chalk and pride, unveiled an equation he claimed would bridge the gaps in modern physics. The room sat in awe, except for one quiet voice in the back. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone sharp. I think there is," came the hesitant reply. What followed wasn't supposed to happen. A child, barely 12 years old, was challenged to confront a problem that had stumped minds far older, far more celebrated. The audience expected silence, or humiliation. What they witnessed instead was something no one could explain. This is the story of how one little girl, meant to be invisible, solved the unsolvable. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A 12-year-old girl held the secret to a problem that had stumped the world's greatest minds. She sat silently in the back of the grand lecture hall, a place she was only meant to clean. But today, she was about to teach its most arrogant professor a lesson in humility. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Crestwood University. It was a place of old money and older traditions. The stone buildings stood like silent judges, their ivy-covered walls having witnessed generations of ambition and intellect. For Helen Miller, it was simply her place of work. She pushed her heavy cleaning cart down the polished marble hallway of the mathematics building, the wheels squeaking a familiar, rhythmic complaint. Her movements were efficient, born of a decade spent wiping away the footprints of others. Beside her, a small figure struggled to keep up, her short legs working hard to match her mother's practiced pace. Abigail Miller, all of 12 years old, clutched a worn copy of a book on number theory. Her blonde hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, but a few stray strands had escaped, catching the light like spun gold. She had the day off from school for a teacher workday, a rare chance to spend the morning with her mother. For Abby, accompanying her mother to the university wasn't a chore. It was a pilgrimage. She loved the quiet dignity of the halls, the scent of old paper and floor wax, and the hushed, important whispers that seemed to seep from the very walls. "Stay close, Abby," Helen said, her voice soft but firm. She glanced down at her daughter, a familiar mix of love and worry in her eyes. "Dr. Thorne is giving a special lecture in the Grand Hall today. We need to be finished in this wing before the students arrive." Abby nodded, her gaze fixed on the posters lining the hallway. They were filled with complex equations and grainy photographs of thoughtful-looking men and women. She traced a symbol with her finger, a partial derivative she recognized from one of her grandfather's old textbooks. Her great-grandfather, General Harrison Vance, had been more than just a war hero. He had been a codebreaker, a man who saw the world in patterns and logic. He believed that mathematics was the language of the universe, and that discipline was its grammar. Before he passed, he had spent hours with a very young Abby, not with toys, but with puzzles and paradoxes. He taught her to see numbers not as a chore, but as a silent, beautiful story. He had bequeathed her his mind, his books, and his most prized possession, a conviction that the most complex problems had the simplest, most elegant solutions if you only had the courage to look for them. Helen stopped her cart outside the doors of the Whitaker Grand Lecture Hall. It was the largest on campus, a magnificent amphitheater of dark wood and deep red velvet seats. A massive chalkboard, wiped clean and waiting, dominated the front of the room. "All right," Helen said, pulling out her supplies. "You can sit in the back corner while I work. But you must be absolutely quiet, do you understand? As quiet as a mouse." "I will, Mama," Abby promised. She slipped into the very last row, her small frame almost disappearing in the large, plush seat. She opened her book, but her eyes were drawn to the imposing stage and the man who had just walked onto it. This was Dr. Wallace Thorne. He was exactly as his reputation described him. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, and wearing an expression of permanent, mild disappointment in the world around him. He was a titan in the field of theoretical physics, a man whose intellect was matched only by his arrogance. He arranged his notes on the polished lectern, his movements precise and dismissive, as if the very air was not quite up to his standards. Students began to file in, filling the tiered seats. They were graduate students and faculty members, the best and brightest the university had to offer. They spoke in low, reverent tones, their notebooks open, their pens poised. A palpable sense of anticipation filled the room. Dr. Thorne was known for his challenging lectures, and today's topic was particularly dense: non-commutative geometry and its application to quantum loopholes. Helen worked quickly and quietly along the far aisle, her back to the stage, emptying trash bins and wiping down railings. She was a ghost in the room, part of the scenery, utterly invisible to the academic elite who were settling into their seats. She wanted to be done and gone before the lecture officially began, before anyone could question why a child was present. Abby watched, fascinated. She didn't understand all the words on the lecture description, but she saw the patterns in the preliminary equations Dr. Thorne began to sketch on the board. He moved with an unearned flourish, his chalk strokes sharp and aggressive. He was not just writing, he was performing. The standard model, he began, his voice booming through the hall, is, for all its celebrated success, an incomplete tapestry. He paused for effect, letting his pronouncement settle. It fails to account for gravitational singularities. It is, to put it plainly for the less nimble minds among us, a theory full of holes. A few sycophantic chuckles rippled through the front rows. Abby saw her mother flinch slightly at his tone and begin working her way faster toward the exit. Dr. Thorne continued his lecture, weaving a complex web of logic and calculation. He filled the board with symbols that made Abby's heart beat a little faster. It was like listening to a piece of music she almost knew. She followed his work, her mind racing to keep up. He was brilliant, there was no denying it. His arguments were intricate, his knowledge vast. But as he reached the core of his new proof, a central equation that he claimed would bridge the gap in the standard model, Abby saw it. It was a small thing, a tiny, almost insignificant assumption in his initial setup. A variable substitution that was elegant, clever, but fundamentally flawed. It created a paradox. Under certain boundary conditions, the entire equation would collapse into meaninglessness. It was the kind of mistake a person makes when they are so in love with their own brilliance that they forget to check the foundation. She didn't mean to make a sound. It was a tiny gasp, a sharp intake of breath so quiet that only one person could have possibly heard it. Dr. Thorne stopped mid-sentence. His head snapped up, his hawk-like eyes scanning the room for the source of the interruption. His gaze swept over the rows of rapt students and landed, with cold precision, on the small girl in the back row. He saw her book, her wide, attentive eyes, and then, with a flick of his gaze, he saw the cleaning cart and the woman in the gray uniform who was now frozen by the exit. His lip curled into a sneer. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He wasn't speaking to the academics. He was speaking to her. Every head in the lecture hall turned. 100 pairs of eyes landed on the little girl in the last row. Abby felt a hot blush creep up her neck. She shrank down in her seat, wishing she could disappear into the red velvet. Beside her, she could feel her mother's panic, a silent, vibrating wave of fear. No, sir," Abby stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Dr. Thorne repeated, amplifying the word. He took a slow step down from the stage, moving closer, enjoying the sudden shift in atmosphere. He had found a diversion, a way to underscore his own superiority. "It seemed you had a reaction to my work. Perhaps you've discovered a flaw? Perhaps you'd like to enlighten us all?" Cruel laughter spread through the audience. It was quiet at first, then bolder. Students exchanged smirks. A professor in the front row shook his head with a weary sigh, as if this was typical of Thorne's behavior. Helen stood rigid by the door, her face pale. She wanted to run to her daughter, to shield her, but she was paralyzed by the weight of so many important eyes. "My daughter was just leaving," Helen said, her voice trembling slightly. "I apologize for the disturbance, Doctor." Dr. Thorne ignored her completely. His focus was entirely on Abby, a predator toying with its prey. "Come now," he pressed, a malicious glint in his eye. "Don't be shy. We are all scholars here. Or mostly." He let that final word hang in the air, a clear insult to Helen's presence. Abby clutched her book to her chest. Her mind was a whirlwind of her great-grandfather's words. Never be afraid of the truth, Abigail. Numbers do not lie, and they do not judge. People do. It's just. She began, her voice still shaky. In the third line, the Kontorovich substitution. The laughter died instantly. A deep, profound silence fell over the hall. The students and faculty stared, mouths slightly agape. The Kontorovich substitution was not an elementary concept. It was a complex technique used in advanced quantum mechanics. For a child to even know the name was startling. Dr. Thorne's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. Surprise, then annoyance, flickered across his face. He quickly masked it with a look of feigned patience. Ah, the Kontorovich substitution. And what, precisely, is your expert opinion on it? He was still mocking her, but now there was a sharp edge to his tone. He had been caught off guard and did not like it. It doesn't remain stable when you approach a zero-point energy field, Abby said, a little more confidently now. The mathematics was a safe place, a fortress of logic where his condescension couldn't touch her. The equation becomes undefined. The silence in the room became heavier, charged with disbelief. A visiting professor from Caltech, a kind-faced older woman named Dr. Evelyn Reed, leaned forward in her seat, her brow furrowed in concentration as she looked back at the board. She saw what the child was talking about. She saw the flaw. Dr. Thorne stared at Abby, his face hardening. The amusement was gone, replaced by a cold fury. This was not just an interruption anymore. It was a challenge to his authority, coming from the most humiliating source imaginable. The daughter of the maid. Is that so? He said, his voice dangerously quiet. An expert on zero-point energy fields. How remarkable. And where did you acquire this advanced knowledge? Your elementary school playground. The insult was sharp, meant to cut deep and put her back in her place. But Abby didn't shrink this time. She thought of her mother, standing mortified by the door. She thought of her great-grandfather, who had faced down entire armies with less fear than she felt now. My great-grandfather taught me, she said simply. Dr. Thorne let out a short, dismissive laugh. And I suppose your great-grandfather was a Nobel laureate? He was General Harrison Vance, Abby said, her voice clear and steady. The name dropped into the silent room like a stone. General Harrison Vance, the hero of the Ardennes campaign, the legendary strategist and codebreaker, the man for whom the university's College of Applied Sciences was named. The name Vance Hall was carved in stone above the main entrance. Dr. Thorne froze. His face went blank with shock. Every person in that room knew the name. They walked through the building named after him every single day. The connection was so absurd, so unbelievable, that no one knew how to react. But Thorne recovered quickly, his arrogance a shield against the impossible. He saw this not as a moment for humility, but as a challenge to be crushed. He would prove that this was a fluke, a lucky guess, a name dropped for effect. General Vance was a soldier, not a physicist. He snapped, his composure cracking. His sentimentality has no place in rigorous science. He turned his back on her and walked decisively toward the chalkboard. He was no longer playing. He was attacking. Since you are so confident, he announced to the room, let us put this expertise to a practical test. He picked up a piece of chalk, the snap as he broke it in half echoing in the tense silence. He gestured with the chalk toward the stage. Come forward, little girl. Come to the board. Helen took a step forward. No, she pleaded softly. Please, sir. She's just a child. But Dr. Thorne's gaze was locked on Abby. It was a command, a dare. The entire room held its breath. They were about to witness either the most brutal humiliation of a child or something they could not yet begin to comprehend. Abby looked at her mother's terrified face. Then she looked at the vast, empty chalkboard. It was a battlefield. Her great-grandfather had taught her that you never back down from a fight for the truth. With a deep breath that did little to calm her hammering heart, Abigail Miller stood up and began the long walk to the front of the lecture hall. The walk from the last row to the stage felt like a mile. Each small footstep echoed in the cavernous room. The faces she passed were a blur of expressions: pity, morbid curiosity, disdain, and on the face of Dr. Reed, a look of intense, focused interest. Abby kept her eyes forward, fixed on the sea of green slate before her. She was keenly aware of her simple dress, her slightly scuffed shoes, and the fact that she was a child in a world of adults. She felt like an imposter, a trespasser about to be exposed. Her mother, Helen, remained by the doors, one hand pressed against her mouth. She was caught in an impossible position. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to snatch her daughter and run, to protect her from the public evisceration that was about to occur. But another part of her, a part that had seen Abby solve complex problems in her notebooks late at night, a part that remembered the fierce pride in her grandfather's eyes as he spoke of the child's gift, was frozen in place. She could not bring herself to interfere with this strange, terrifying destiny that was unfolding. Abby reached the stage and stepped up onto the raised platform. She was so small she seemed swallowed by the space. The lectern towered over her. Dr. Thorne stood beside the chalkboard, a grim, self-satisfied expression on his face. He had successfully turned this into a spectacle, and he was the ringmaster. "Now," he said, his voice loud and patronizing, "let's not overcomplicate things. We'll start with a simple warm-up exercise." He turned to the board and, with swift, precise strokes, wrote out a partial differential equation. To the graduate students in the room, it was a standard, if challenging, problem from fluid dynamics. The Navier-Stokes equation adapted for a non-Newtonian fluid. It was something a doctoral candidate would be expected to solve, but it was by no means simple. For a 12-year-old, it should have been as incomprehensible as a foreign language. The word simple was an act of pure academic cruelty. "Take your time," Dr. Thorne said, the false generosity in his tone making it clear he expected her to stand there in humiliated silence until he dismissed her. He held out the piece of chalk. Abby's hand trembled as she reached for it. The chalk felt cold and foreign in her small fingers. She stared at the equation on the board. The symbols swirled in her vision for a moment, a chaotic jumble. The weight of all those eyes felt like a physical pressure. Behind her, she heard a student whisper to another, "This is cruel." Even for Thorne. She took a slow, deep breath, just as her great-grandfather had taught her. "Center yourself, Abigail. Look at the terrain. Don't see the enemy. See the problem. The problem is never personal." The numbers and symbols began to settle. The chaos receded. She saw the flow. She saw the relationships between the variables. It was a system, and like any system, it had rules. It had a beginning and an end. She had never seen this exact equation before, but she had seen hundreds like it in her great-grandfather's books. He had been obsessed with fluid dynamics, believing its principles applied to everything from airflow over a wing to the movement of troops on a battlefield. She raised the chalk to the board. The tip hovered for a moment, a tiny white speck against a vast green universe. And then, she made her first mark. The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of intense concentration. Dr. Thorne leaned back against the lectern, arms crossed, a smirk still playing on his lips, ready to watch her fail. Abby began to write. Her first few lines were hesitant, the chalk strokes a bit shaky. She was laying out her initial conditions, defining her terms. Then, her confidence grew. Her hand became steadier. The scratching of the chalk was the only sound in the hall. She moved from one line to the next with a methodical grace that was unnerving. She wasn't guessing. She was navigating. She used a tensor transformation to simplify the pressure gradient, an elegant move that made several students in the front rows straighten up in their seats. They recognized the technique. It was efficient, clean. Dr. Thorne's smirk slowly faded. He uncrossed his arms and took a step closer to the board, his expression shifting from condescension to mild confusion. He watched her work, his eyes scanning for errors. He found none. Her logic was flawless. Her execution, impeccable. Abby was no longer in the room. In her mind, she was back in her great-grandfather's dusty study, the smell of old books and pipe tobacco in the air. He was there beside her, his voice a low rumble. "Don't just solve it, Abby. Find the beauty in it. Find the shortest path. An elegant solution is a victory in itself." She reached a difficult integration. Instead of using the standard, brute force method that would have taken 10 lines of complex algebra, she paused. She tilted her head, just as she had seen her great-grandfather do countless times. Then she made a substitution, referencing a Green's function. It was a stunningly intuitive leap, a shortcut that was both brilliant and correct. It bypassed the most difficult part of the problem entirely. In the front row, Dr. Evelyn Reed's eyes widened. She quietly took off her glasses and began to clean them, as if she could not believe what she was seeing. She had given this very problem to her own graduate students at Caltech last year. The cleverest among them had solved it, but not a single one had seen the shortcut Abby had just employed. After 4 minutes of nonstop writing, Abby wrote the final line of the solution. She underlined it twice, a habit her great-grandfather had insisted upon. "Mark your victory," he used to say. She placed the small piece of chalk neatly in the tray at the bottom of the board and stepped back. The hall was utterly still. A complete, unbroken silence hung in the air. The solution, long and complex but perfectly ordered, covered a large section of the chalkboard. It was not just correct, it was a work of art. Dr. Thorne stared at the board. He walked its length, his eyes tracing every symbol, every line of her proof. His face was a mask of disbelief. He was searching, desperately, for a mistake, a flaw, anything that would allow him to reclaim his authority. There was nothing. He turned from the board and looked at Abby, truly looked at her, for the first time. He didn't see the maid's daughter anymore. He saw an inexplicable, infuriating mystery. "That is," he started, his voice strained. He cleared his throat. "That is correct." The admission seemed to physically pain him. He forced a dismissive tone, a standard application of known principles. Any competent student should have been able to manage it. But his words rang hollow. The lie was obvious to everyone in the room. Dr. Reed in the front row put her glasses back on and shook her head slowly, a small, incredulous smile on her face. The students weren't looking at Dr. Thorne anymore. They were all looking at the 12-year-old girl in the simple dress who stood quietly on the stage. Unwilling to accept defeat, unwilling to let this child dismantle his reputation, Dr. Thorne's pride took a dark turn. He would not be upstaged. If she could solve a difficult problem, he would give her an impossible one. He would break her. "Very well," he said, the edge in his voice now sharp as glass. He picked up an eraser and, with angry, violent swipes, cleared a large space on the board. "The warm-up is over. Let's try something more substantial." He turned and began to write a new equation. This one was different. It was jagged, complex, filled with esoteric symbols Abby had only ever seen in the most advanced journals, the ones her great-grandfather had kept locked in a special cabinet. It was not a problem from a textbook. This was the frontier. This was a piece of his own, unpublished research. "This," he announced, his eyes fixed on Abby, "is a problem related to the topology of quantum spacetime. It has implications for understanding what happens at the very instant of the Big Bang." He turned to face her, his expression a cold mask of intellectual superiority. "It has, to date, remained unsolved." He was not asking her to solve a problem. He was asking her to do what he and his most brilliant colleagues had failed to do. It was a checkmate, a final, public execution of her unexpected talent. "If you would like to return to your seat," he said, the mock courtesy returning to his voice, "no one would blame you." The challenge was laid. The entire room seemed to lean forward as one. They had just witnessed a miracle. Now they were about to see the miracle extinguished. Abby looked at the monstrous equation on the board. A knot of genuine fear tightened in her stomach. She did not recognize the notation. The structure was alien to her. For the first time, she felt completely and utterly lost. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through her concentration. "Maybe he's right," a small voice whispered in her head. "You don't belong here." She looked over at her mother, who was watching her with a look of pure, agonizing love. Then, she looked back at the equation. And deep within the chaotic tangle of symbols, she saw a flicker of something familiar. A pattern, a whisper of a logic she had heard once before, in a story her great-grandfather had told her about his time as a codebreaker in the war. He had called it ghost tracing, finding the structure of a hidden message by looking at the patterns in the gibberish that surrounded it. She picked up the chalk again. Her hand was steady now. Her fear was gone, replaced by a surge of pure, focused curiosity. She would not solve it for him. She would not solve it for the audience. She would solve it for the man who had taught her that nothing, not even the universe itself, was ever truly unsolvable. The equation sprawled across the chalkboard like a string of barbed wire. It was a fortress of symbols, designed to be impenetrable. The silence in the lecture hall stretched thin, pulled taut by the collective anticipation of failure. Everyone in the room, from the most junior student to the most seasoned professor, understood the cruelty of this moment. This was no longer a test. It was an execution. Abby felt a tremor in her hand. The piece of chalk suddenly seemed to weigh a pound. She stared at the problem, her mind a blank slate of fear. The complex notation, the unfamiliar operators. It was a language she had never seen. Dr. Thorne had succeeded. He had found the absolute limit of her knowledge and dragged her to it in front of 100 witnesses. She could hear the soft rustle of clothing as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She could feel the pity. It was worse than the laughter. Her gaze drifted past the chalkboard, toward the dusty corner of the stage where a water pitcher sat on a small table. For a second, the light caught the glass just right, and it reminded her of the thick spectacles her great-grandfather used to wear. And then, the memory came, not as a fleeting thought, but as a warm, immersive wave. She was 8 years old, sitting on a worn leather ottoman in his study. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and rain. Outside, a thunderstorm raged, but inside, it was a sanctuary of quiet thought. General Vance sat in his high-backed chair, a thick file of old, declassified documents on his lap. They were pages of gibberish, long strings of letters and numbers from wartime communiques. They thought this code was unbreakable, he had told her, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He tapped a page with his thick finger. The finest minds in the enemy's intelligence division designed it. They used the most advanced mathematics of their day. They believed they had created perfect chaos. But you broke it, little Abby had said, her eyes wide. Ah, he chuckled. But I didn't attack the code, Abigail. That's the mistake everyone else was making. They were trying to fight the fortress wall head-on. I looked for its shadow. Its echo. He pulled a clean sheet of paper toward them and began to sketch. Imagine the real message is a person walking down the street. The encrypted message is their shadow. The shadow looks distorted, stretched, sometimes barely like a person at all. But it is always connected to the source. It must follow the same rules of movement. You see, he had spent the next hour showing her. He didn't teach her cryptography. He taught her pattern recognition in its purest form. He showed her how to ignore the noise, the deliberate misinformation, and look for the faintest traces of underlying structure. He called it ghost tracing. The answer is always there, he had said, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he leaned in close. Always. But it's shy. It hides behind the noise. You must be patient. You must be quiet. And you must look at the problem from a place they never expected anyone to be looking from. The lecture hall came rushing back into focus. The rows of faces, the imposing figure of Dr. Thorne, the monstrous equation on the board. But something had changed. The fear was gone. The equation no longer looked like barbed wire. It was a shadow, and Abby knew, with a sudden, bone-deep certainty, how to find the person casting it. She raised the chalk to the board. Dr. Thorne watched, a cynical arch to his eyebrow. He expected a few meaningless scribbles, then tears. Abby didn't start at the beginning of the equation. She didn't even write on the same line. She moved to a clean space on the far right of the board and wrote a single, simple-looking matrix. It was a 2x2 grid with 4 numbers in it. To the physicists and mathematicians in the room, it was utterly nonsensical. It had no apparent connection to the topological nightmare on the left. A student in the third row stifled a laugh. Dr. Thorne shook his head, a look of vindicated disgust on his face. If you are finished with the abstract art, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, you may step down. Abby ignored him. She wrote a second matrix next to the first, then a third. She was creating a sequence. It was the beginning of a pattern, a rhythm only she could hear. Dr. Reed, in the front row, leaned forward again. She was no longer watching the girl. She was watching the matrices. There was a logic to their progression, but it was a logic she had never seen before. It was not from any textbook. What is she doing? A professor whispered to Dr. Reed. I don't know, Dr. Reed whispered back, her voice tight with fascination. She's mapping the problem's symmetries, but not in 3 dimensions. It's almost as if she's adding a fourth, a rotational one. Abby continued to work, her movements now fluid and certain. She was translating. She was taking Dr. Thorne's complex, ugly equation and recasting it piece by piece into her new, simpler language of matrices. She was breaking the code. The chalk flew across the board, the rhythmic scratching the only sound in the spellbound room. The left side of the board remained untouched, a monument to unearned complexity. The right side was filling with her elegant, symmetrical patterns. Dr. Thorne's smug certainty began to waver. He stared at her work, his brow deeply furrowed. He could not follow her logic. It was alien. It was like watching someone build a sophisticated engine using parts he had never seen before. And yet, he could not deny the internal consistency of her work. There was a terrifying, undeniable rigor to it. "This is not a recognized methodology," he said sharply, taking a step toward her. His voice held a note of accusation, as if she were cheating. "You cannot simply invent your own mathematical rules." Abby paused. She turned her head slightly and looked at him. Her blue eyes were clear and calm. "I'm not inventing rules," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "I'm just counting in a different direction." She turned back to the board. The statement, so simple and yet so profound, silenced him. He stood, frozen, a look of complete bewilderment on his face. Counting in a different direction? It was the most childish explanation for the most sophisticated display of mathematics he had ever witnessed. Now she began to connect the two sides of the board. She drew lines, operators, transformations. She showed how her simple matrices were, in fact, perfect analogs for the most complex parts of his equation. She was building a bridge from his world to hers. And as she built it, the students began to see. Audible gasps rippled through the hall as they understood what she was doing. She was simplifying the problem, not just solving it, but reducing it to a form so elementary it was almost beautiful. She was collapsing entire dimensions of the problem, folding them into her matrix operators. A section that would have required pages of painstaking calculation, she handled in 3 lines. It was mathematical magic. "My God," Dr. Reed breathed. She turned to her colleague. "It's the Yilmaz-Finkelstein conjecture. The one that was just a theoretical footnote in last month's Journal of Physics. The one that proposed a multidimensional approach to spacetime topology. No one's ever applied it before. It was considered too abstract, too radical." The room was electric now. The initial pity for Abby had long since evaporated, replaced by a growing, thunderstruck awe. The students who had laughed at her were now on the edges of their seats, their notebooks forgotten, their faces a mixture of disbelief and reverence. They knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Helen, still standing by the door, finally lowered her hand from her mouth. Her fear had been replaced by a fierce, brilliant pride that brought tears to her eyes. She was no longer watching her child. She was watching a force of nature. Abby reached the final stage. She had translated the entire monstrous equation into her own language. All that remained was the final calculation, a step that was now, thanks to her revolutionary method, shockingly simple. She paused, the chalk hovering over the board. Dr. Thorne stood like a statue, his face pale, his arrogance completely shattered, leaving behind only the raw, exposed ego of a man who has just witnessed his entire worldview dismantled by a child. "That simplification," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at one of her transformations. "The way you collapsed the tensor field. How could you possibly know how to do that?" Abby looked from the board to his face. "You look for the echo," she said quietly, the words of her great-grandfather now spoken into the heart of this great hall of learning. Before Dr. Thorne could respond, Dr. Reed stood up. Her voice, when she spoke, was filled with an excitement that bordered on jubilant. "She's right, Wallace," she said, her voice carrying across the stunned auditorium. "The Yilmaz-Finkelstein conjecture was just a theory. A ghost. This child just proved it's real." She looked at Abby with an expression of profound respect. "How did you know about it, dear?" It was only published 3 weeks ago. Every eye in the room was on Abby. The question hung in the air. How? Abby looked down at the chalk dust on her fingers. For so many years, this world inside her head had been a secret, a private game she played with the memory of an old soldier. Now, it was laid bare for all to see. "I've never heard of those names," she said truthfully, her voice clear and strong. "My great-grandfather taught me how to look for patterns. He said most problems aren't hard. They're just noisy." With that, she turned back to the board. She wrote the final line of the solution. It wasn't a long, complicated string of symbols. It was a single, elegant expression. She placed a neat box around it, just as she had for the first problem. Then, she did one more thing. She went back to the very first equation Dr. Thorne had put on the board, the one from his lecture, the one with the flaw she had noticed from the back of the room. With a few swift strokes, she showed how her new method not only solved the unsolvable problem, but also perfectly corrected the error in his own work. She closed the loop. It was a final, devastating, and utterly elegant checkmate. She put the chalk down in the tray. The sound was like a gavel. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. The solution glowed on the board, a testament to a mind that worked on a different plane. It was more than a solution. It was a revelation. Then, a single student in the front row, a young man who had been one of the first to laugh, stood up and began to clap. His applause was tentative at first, then stronger. Another student stood, then another. Dr. Reed stood, clapping loudly, a brilliant smile on her face. Within seconds, the entire lecture hall was on its feet. The sound of 100 people applauding filled the room, washing over the stage in a great, crashing wave. It wasn't the polite applause of an academic audience. It was a roar, a standing ovation for the 12-year-old girl who had just rewritten the rules of their world. She stood motionless on the stage, the small, half-used piece of chalk still resting on the tray. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the hundreds of clapping hands, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. It was as if she were watching a scene from a movie. A moment ago, she was just Abby, the maid's daughter, hiding in the back of the room. Now she was this, the center of an academic world she was never meant to be a part of. Her eyes found her mother. Helen was no longer by the door. She had taken a few hesitant steps into the main aisle, her face streaked with tears, her expression a dizzying mix of shock, pride, and a fierce, protective love. Their gazes locked across the crowded room, and in that moment, the thunderous applause faded into a distant hum. There was only her mother's face, the anchor in her suddenly tumultuous world. On the stage, Dr. Thorne was a man adrift. The ovation was not for him. The reverence in the room was not directed at his intellect. He was an obstacle that had been overcome, a footnote in a story that was now, astonishingly, all about the child beside him. He stared at the chalkboard, at the elegant, irrefutable proof that had undone him. He looked like a king who had just discovered his castle was made of sand. His shoulders slumped. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by the hollow gray ash of humiliation. He had sought to make an example of a child and had, in turn, been made a fool of by a prodigy. The irony was a bitter pill, and he was choking on it. The applause eventually subsided, leaving a charged, buzzing silence in its wake. No one knew what to do or say next. The lecture was forgotten. The academic order of things had been turned completely upside down. It was Dr. Evelyn Reed who finally broke the spell. She made her way from the front row, stepping up onto the stage with a sense of purpose. She bypassed Dr. Thorne completely, her focus entirely on Abby. She knelt down so that she was at eye level with the child, her kind face crinkling into a warm, genuine smile. "That was the most remarkable thing I have ever witnessed in my 40 years as a physicist," she said, her voice soft but clear, meant for Abby alone. "My name is Evelyn, and I am very, very pleased to meet you." Abby looked into the woman's intelligent, compassionate eyes and felt the last of her tension melt away. "I'm Abby," she whispered. "I know," Dr. Reed said, her smile widening. "I have a feeling the whole world will know your name soon." She glanced over at Helen, who was now slowly, timidly approaching the stage. "And you must be her mother. You must be incredibly proud." Helen reached the stage, her work-worn hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked from the esteemed professor to her daughter, her heart too full for words. She simply nodded, tears welling in her eyes again. Dr. Reed stood up and turned to face the rest of the room. "I believe," she announced, her voice resonating with authority, "that this lecture is concluded. But I think we can all agree that our education has just begun." She then turned her gaze, sharp and direct, upon Dr. Thorne. The disgraced professor flinched as if struck. He had been trying to shrink into the background, to become invisible, but Dr. Reed's attention pinned him to the spot. "Wallace," she said, her tone no longer warm but cool and precise. "You owe this child an apology." The demand was unequivocal. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Thorne's face, already pale, turned a blotchy, furious red. Apologize? To the maid's daughter? To the child who had just intellectually dismantled him in front of his peers and students? The very idea was a violation of the natural order as he understood it. His pride, though battered and broken, still had its reflexes. An apology for what? He spat, his voice a low, venomous rasp. For challenging a student? For upholding academic rigor? No, Wallace, Dr. Reed said, her voice cutting through his bluster like a scalpel. An apology for your cruelty, for your arrogance, for using your position of power to bully a child in an attempt to soothe your own fragile ego. You did not test her. You tried to break her. And you failed. Each word was a hammer blow. Dr. Thorne recoiled, his face a mask of fury and shame. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. He looked out at the faces of his students, his colleagues. He saw no support. He saw only contempt and disappointment. He had been exposed, not just as a flawed academic, but as a small and petty man. Without another word, he turned on his heel. He snatched his papers from the lectern, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and stalked off the stage, disappearing through a side door. His exit was not dignified. It was the flight of a defeated man. A tense silence followed his departure. Dr. Reed turned back to Abby and Helen, her expression softening once more. Good riddance, she said with a wry shake of her head. Now, to more important matters. She took a business card from her jacket pocket. Mrs. Miller, Abigail. I am the head of the Department of Physics at the California Institute of Technology. I came here today expecting to be bored by a lecture. Instead, I believe I have found the future of theoretical physics. She offered the card to Helen. I understand this is a lot to take in, but when you've had a moment to breathe, I would very much like to talk to you both. About everything. About Abby's education. About her future. A mind like hers, it doesn't belong in the back of a classroom. It belongs at the very front. Helen stared at the card in her hand. California Institute of Technology. It was a name from another universe, a world of prestige and intellect she had only ever cleaned the floors of. The idea that this world was now reaching out, inviting her daughter in, was too immense to fully comprehend. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the air. I believe Crestwood University might have something to say about that. All heads turned. Standing in the main aisle was the university's dean, a stately man named Dean Albright, who had clearly been summoned by a panicked faculty member. He had an expression of grave seriousness on his face, but his eyes, when they looked at Abby, were wide with wonder. He had heard the story in a breathless, jumbled report. He had seen the proof still glowing on the chalkboard. Dr. Reed, the dean said, nodding respectfully. A pleasure to see you, though I wish the circumstances were less dramatic. He then walked toward the stage. He did not address Helen as the maid. He did not address Abby as a child. He addressed them as people of sudden and immense importance. Mrs. Miller, Miss Miller, he began, his voice imbued with a new, profound respect. On behalf of Crestwood University, I wish to offer my most sincere and profound apologies for the conduct of Dr. Thorne. His behavior was inexcusable and does not reflect the values of this institution. He paused, letting his words sink in. His tenure is, as of this moment, under immediate review. The dean then turned his full attention to Abby. Young lady, he said, his voice softening. What you did here today, it's a miracle. We have a building on this campus named after your great-grandfather. It seems we have been remiss in not recognizing that his legacy is not just in stone, but in blood. He looked from Abby to Helen. This university would be honored, no, privileged, to offer Abigail a full, unconditional scholarship, effective immediately. We will design a custom curriculum for her. We will give her access to our finest minds, our best resources. She can start tomorrow. Her place is here, with us. With her great-grandfather's legacy. The room was silent. Two of the world's most prestigious institutions were now vying for a 12-year-old girl who, an hour ago, was sitting quietly in the back row, hoping not to be noticed. Helen felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. She looked at the dean's earnest face, then at Dr. Reed's kind, intelligent eyes. She looked at the grand lecture hall, the place that represented a barrier, a social wall she could clean but never cross. And now that wall had crumbled. Her daughter had not just crossed it, she had obliterated it with a piece of chalk. She looked down at Abby, who was watching the two powerful academics with a calm, unnerving clarity. She hadn't been intimidated by Thorne's arrogance, and she did not seem swayed by these grand offers. She was simply watching, processing. Mama, Abby said, her voice a small, quiet island in the sea of overwhelming possibility. Helen squeezed her daughter's shoulder. She knew this was a moment that would define the rest of their lives. A choice had to be made, but for the first time in a very, very long time, it felt like a choice they were truly free to make. I think, Helen said, her voice surprisingly steady, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. I think my daughter and I need to go home and have some lunch. Both Dean Albright and Dr. Reed looked momentarily taken aback by this simple, domestic response to their monumental offers. Then, they both smiled, understanding perfectly. Of course, said Dean Albright. Please, take all the time you need. Enjoy your lunch, Abby, Dr. Reed added warmly. You've certainly earned it. As Helen guided Abby off the stage and down the aisle, the students and professors parted for them, creating a clear path to the exit. The looks on their faces were no longer filled with pity or condescension. They were looks of pure, unadulterated awe. They were looking at Abby as if she were a visiting dignitary, a celestial event. As they walked out of the grand lecture hall and into the bright afternoon sun, Helen realized that nothing would ever be the same again. They had walked in that morning as the help. They were walking out as the future. 1 year later, the lecture hall was the same, but the energy was entirely different. The room was filled to capacity, not with the university's elite, but with people from all walks of life, students, townspeople, retirees, and a busload of wide-eyed middle schoolers who had come on a special field trip. On the stage, a new, state-of-the-art digital smartboard had replaced the old green chalkboard. In front of it stood Abigail Miller. At 13, she was a little taller, her blonde hair cut in a practical bob, but her eyes held the same intense, thoughtful clarity. She was dressed not in a simple frock, but in a crisp blazer and jeans, a special fellowship pin from the California Institute of Technology gleaming on her lapel. She had accepted both offers. In a unique arrangement brokered by a humble Dean Albright and an enthusiastic Dr. Reed, Abby was now a joint fellow at both Crestwood and Caltech. She spent her semesters at Crestwood, living at home, and her summers in California, working with Dr. Reed's top research team. Today, she was giving her first public lecture, launching Crestwood's new Young Innovators outreach program. Her topic, The Shape of a Shadow, Finding Simple Patterns in Complex Problems. In the front row sat Helen Miller. She was no longer wearing her gray work uniform. She was dressed in a smart blue dress, a confident smile on her face. She had quit her job as a maid months ago. A generous endowment, established in Abby's name by a group of wealthy university alumni, and discreetly contributed to by a repentant Dr. Thorne, who had been demoted to a non-teaching research position, had ensured that Helen would never have to push a cleaning cart again. She now worked part-time at the university library, helping young students navigate the archives, a job she loved. Abby finished her explanation of a complex theorem, her voice clear and engaging, free of jargon. She made the universe seem accessible, beautiful. A young girl in the third row, one of the middle schoolers, tentatively raised her hand. Abby smiled, a warm, genuine smile that lit up her face. Yes, she said, her voice full of encouragement. Don't be shy. The girl stood up, clutching her notebook. I don't get it. She stammered, her face turning red. It seems too hard. I'm not a genius like you. Abby's smile softened. She put down her stylus and walked to the front of the stage, closer to the audience. My great-grandfather was a soldier, she said, her voice resonating with a quiet power that held the entire room captive. He taught me that the bravest thing you can do is not to have all the answers, but to be willing to ask the questions. Genius isn't about what you know. It's about being brave enough to admit what you don't. The only impossible problem is the one you're too afraid to try. She looked from the young girl to the rest of the audience, her gaze sweeping over every hopeful face. Your question, she said, her voice ringing with the profound, simple truth she had learned on this very stage, is the most important part of the solution. Helen watched her daughter, her heart swelling with a pride so immense it felt like it could light up the entire hall. The shy, quiet girl was gone, and in her place stood a young woman who had found her voice, her purpose, and her own elegant solution to the world. The day of the lecture hadn't just changed their lives. It had changed the future, one question at a time. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.